The responsible design of AI systems requires we do more than develop algorithms that merely perform well. We would also like these systems to be transparent and explainable, for instance, so that we might allow different users to gather appropriate insights about models relevant to their usage contexts. My guest today, Vera Liao, has been studying explainability and transparency in AI systems for years. As a principal scientist at Microsoft Research, she's led and supported incredible work that seeks to, among other things, integrate studies of how humans interact with and understand AI systems. We spoke about her work looking at how we might develop explainability solutions for different users' needs, where existing explainability methods fall short, what transparency might look like in the age of large language models, and much more. This is the Gradient Podcast, and I am your host, Daniel Bashir. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, or if you are new, you may or may not know that The Gradient is a project run by a few engineers, like me, and grad students. The podcast is, at the moment, a one-person effort. If you like what we're doing, it would mean a lot to us and to me if you'd consider supporting us by either writing a review wherever you're listening to this podcast, or upgrading to a paid subscription on Substack. But now, without further ado, Vera Liao. Vera, one thing that has always stuck out to me about your research is not just the fact that you're trying to bring a very human-centered perspective to the different topics you study, and really probably spend a lot more time with people and thinking about how they interact with systems than I believe most researchers do. But a lot of your work also goes into what I think is contra a lot of the narratives we see about AI today, the path dependence of the way we build systems, the way we build them to interact with people. And I'd really love to hear a little bit about your background and how you got into AI in the first place and sort of got interested in all of this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm being a fan of the podcast. I always found the discussion very thoughtful. So really honored to be here. Perhaps I will start with kind of my academic identity. I feel probably the best way to describe myself is that I am a HCI, human-computer interaction research, working on AI technology. I'm often interested in AI technology that kind of just emerging from research. Hopefully, my research can contribute to this technical work. As you mentioned, my interests are often about how people are using this technology or will using that technology, often grounded in specific applications. What are the limits or pitfall of this technology as shown in people's interaction or use? And also not just the technical part, but also how we can design an application, right, to augment the benefit of this AI technology and also mitigate their limitation, their risk, and potential harms. So not sure how far you want to go back to my background. I think my quote-unquote journey into AI is a little bit accidental, but I would say there are a lot of continuities in terms of the kind of questions I'm interested in. So I did my PhD in computer science, but I had a lot of training in human factors. My advisor has a qualitative science background, so a lot of my methodologies are experimental, quantitative. My PhD work is on this topic of diversity enhancing design, right? How we can design a system in a way that we can encourage people to seek different diverse opinion, consume diverse opinion, whether it's in this information system like online search or social media context where people discuss controversial topics. So I would say the topic is very broadly situated in the area of studying how people interact with information and how we design information system. And that is still reflected in a lot of my work on studying interaction with AI system. By the end of my PhD, around the year 2015, 2016, that was kind of the last hype cycle of chatbots. I don't know if you remember that time. So there's a lot of article like, oh, the next century is going to be conversational. People don't need to click around on GUI interface. People can talk to computer. I got very excited about how this kind of system really change people's interaction, how they look for information, consume, they change their behaviors a lot. So I kind of happily jumped on this wagon. That time I also graduated and joined IBM research. And of course, conversational AI has always been a focus of IBM, like Watson, that goes back to Watson. So I worked on chatbots for a few years. I would say got a little bit of a disillusion or annoyed at that point. I just feel like that time this conversational technology was really not ready. So it's very different from how these days where people are developing LLM based chatbot, ChatGPT. You really have to like think about, oh, for my chatbot, even it's a very very small domain, what are the topics I need to cover? What are the intents that people will have with the chatbot? Now you have to train hundreds of thousands of classifier to recognize those intents. So I was annoyed that people have a lot of desire when they think about having conversational interaction, but it's very hard to satisfy that. There's a lot of breakdowns. But I think looking back, what I didn't realize at that point is that this understanding this gap between what technology can do and what people need in this social world and bridge this gap has really become a theme that motivate a lot of my research. I might mention this term sociotechnical gap a lot in this discussion. So this is a paper written by Mark Arkman, who is a faculty at University of Michigan, that had a lot of impact on me on the field of HCI, which is talking about there is this socio-technical gap. But it's really inevitable, not just because technology is ready, but because computation, it is, in essence, it's about precision, formalization, abstraction. But human needs in the social world, they are very contextual, nuanced, fluid. So this kind of gap is just inevitable. You can try hard to bridge this gap, narrow the gap, but it will always be there. So that has become something that kind of I struggle with, but also like hopefully help bridge a little bit in my work. And another turn of my research came around the year 2019. So at that time, so IBM has a different research department called Trustworthy AI. So this term is used in some organization as responsible AI. So it's really about mitigating risk of harm of AI technology, but it's often started with principles like fairness, explainability, accountability. So I think in 2019, it was also this topic started to gain a lot of traction in academic community conferences like FACT. So around that time, this trustworthy AI team, they want to develop a series of toolkits. The goal is really to make this work in the research community, say fairness technique, explainability technique, to be more accessible for practitioners, data scientists, starting with like code libraries and also educational material. So that team kind of approached me. They at that time they want basically like a amateur UX designer to help them think about this user experience design side of things. So I started working on this toolkit called AI Explainability 360, which is again hopefully making a dozens of this explainability algorithm accessible for practitioner. But I think I was really again struggled with or annoyed by at that time especially there's actually very little adoption in practice to see in product. Even these days, you probably, even we talk about explainable AI a lot, but you probably don't see a lot of explanation in kind of consumer facing products. So at that time, I feel, oh, we're going to put out this dozens or more algorithms, but we really know very little about what kind of explanation people really want. And there's some unique challenge with developing toolkits is your user group is not a specific group. You don't even know who exactly are the end users. So it's also very hard to do kind of a traditional user research to understand that. So starting from there, and then that's a kind of starting point for me for years of research. I try to understand what is this design space of explainable AI or AI transparency, and also do some human study in specific application and trying to see how people interact, where things might fall short. I'm happy to dig a little deeper into specific studies.
This is a great breakdown. And before we get into some specific ways this manifests, I want to start actually with a framing question. One of the first things you said about your research was articulating HCI as sort of contributing to technical work. And I do feel like we're still in a place where maybe I don't know how to exactly describe the way it's articulated or the discourse, but it's sort of like we have HCI and we have AI, or we have AI and we have AI explainability. And so it seems like these are still kind of thought of as separate things, right? People do the AI capabilities work, and then we start worrying about explanation, interpretability, all of these things that relate to how humans are then going to be interacting with those systems. And I'm curious how, in your own work, you think about that separation. Is that something that you feel like makes a lot of sense right now? Is that something you hope might disappear a little bit in the future? I'd just love to know how you think about that.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a great question. That's something I contemplate a lot. I feel we've seen a lot of progress in the past few years. I feel this whole um, coming from AI field, this framing of human-centered AI and also responsible AI that emphasize kind of socio-technical perspective, understand specific harm, specific issue that we can have with different stakeholder, really help with bringing in HCI perspective and also emphasize why we need HCI. It definitely, I feel like we came a long way from the beginning when AI researchers just start talking about human-centered AI. There seems to feel like, oh, we need to reinvent a whole field about how do we do user research, right? I think in my work, there are definitely a lot of people thinking in terms of how we bring the community together through like also community building, having conferences, workshop to bring people together. I feel like in my work is also I have kind of more practical focus, thinking about like where HCI method and practice can actually make a difference. It also very much coming with my own experience as I started with working like a designer for chatbot and realized things doesn't work. I also do a lot of work in terms of working with practitioners, understanding like designers, UX researcher on the ground, what their struggles are. I think one perspective that for my work I find really helpful is this differentiation of upstream and downstream. But there's also many level of upstream, right? In responsible AI, some people say upstream is about developing an algorithm, and downstream is about taking that algorithm or model to be incorporated in applications, and people will use that. But I think in practice, there's also, at least there is a level of researcher developing AI algorithm. In practice, there's also data scientists or more engineer making choices in terms of which model to use. There's so many parameters to choose. So I think for me, the progress also goes from, in the beginning, I was very much focused on what HCI or UX can do for the very downstream, like putting an interface, how the UI might look like. Then slowly I go to actually we need to do user research early on to inform which algorithm we choose, which parameters we set. And more I realize there's also fundamental lack of this human perspective in the research development itself. So I like to, I don't think I'm there yet, but I like to think in terms of the whole ecosystem going from downstream and upstream where HCI methods, HCI perspective can make a difference.
You spoke earlier as well about the sociotechnical gap, and I suppose one way this manifests also is in that desire for explanation. So, to what you're saying about starting downstream with HCI and then going further and further upstream, one really interesting point somebody I heard make recently was this is a little bit more about the interface design component of explanation and interpretability, but the idea was essentially that well, you can go ahead and take your language model that we have today and patch on all of these things that purport to make it more understandable to an end user, to make it more transparent, and so on. But if the model you're dealing with itself lacks some capability, then in a way you're maybe building false trust. You're almost lying to a user. Do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think a lot of my work is actually not in terms of on this interface. We already settled with a particular explanation how we change that interface. This is important. There's a lot of communication problem there, but also there are so many different algorithms, right? They actually provide very different forms of explanation. So we have to start with picking the right forms of explanation. And also within that, there are algorithm, whether it's a directly interpretable model versus using the post hoc, that's at a very basic level, will that make a difference? So I think a lot of my interest is not just in terms of putting a UI on explanation, but how do we pick the right algorithm to begin with?
Great. Let's get into some of your specific work. And before we kind of come back to this topic in your specific papers, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the earlier work you did during your PhD that you talked about. You were studying filter bubbles and expert voices, echo chambers, all these super interesting dynamics that really pertain to the ways that we kind of exist online, the ways we form judgments, we judge others' expertise, the information we respond to. I'm curious just to hear you speak a little bit about what you learned for your studies and maybe some of the takeaways for things like the design of online social communities, any takeaways that you've had yourself, perhaps, in how you use social media, for instance.
Yeah, sure. So it's been a while, so I'm gonna probably talk it at a pretty high level, even though some of my interests around this echo chamber is coming back a bit, especially with current like LLM search that also change how people interact as well. So yeah, for my PhD around that time, I think this is the topic where things like filter bubble, political polarization is very much in the public discourse. In general, my interest was how we can design system in a way that would make people a little bit more receptive towards different opposing opinion. We know that by nature, people have things like confirmation bias, selective exposure, that would just naturally gravitate towards looking for confirmative or reinforced opinions. At that time, also, there's some academic work showing that there's very clear individual difference that some people are more open to different opinion, or if you have such a certain design, like showing opinions side by side, some people are more open to click different opinions, some people don't. So I kind of started with this point of why we have that individual difference, and if you understand why, maybe we can do a little bit better to design for different people. So I went to read a lot of psychology study of selective exposure, confirmation bias. So one theory I leveraged was why people have different tendency, and there are really kind of two underlying motivation that change people's or determine people's tendency. So one is something called accuracy motivation. That is, are you motivated to learn this topic well? Are you motivated to have an accurate understanding of this topic? And another is defense motivation. That is to, so it goes back to also the reason we look for confirmative opinion is because ultimately we want to avoid cognitive dissonance, this discomfort when we're being challenged, when we have to reconcile different information. But if you have a very high defense motivation, then you have a higher tendency to want to avoid different opinions. But the nice thing is also when you say accuracy motivation and defense motivation, they're really kind of umbrella term. There can be many reasons contribute that, whether you're just an open-minded person by nature, or you are particular topic, you have a kind of high learning motivation that can also contribute to accuracy motivation. So once we have that, we have kind of scale to infer where this person on the spectrum, for example, of accuracy motivation. Now we see a huge difference is if someone, I guess, sort of a little bit of a sad results from some study we did was we tried a lot of kind of intervention, so different designs to hopefully make people more open to different opinion. But it almost always only work for people who already kind of have high accuracy motivation to begin with. And in our study, interesting is constantly around like 25% people. And for the rest of 75% people, it was actually very hard to nudge them to change opinion. And then we tried kind of different designs. For example, for people who have high accuracy motivation, what we want to do is highlight the content itself has values, that the content bring different perspective. There's some common ground. The content is really helpful. Versus for people who have lower accuracy motivation, sometimes we have to leverage more this kind of a heuristic-based nudge that trigger them to think, okay, this is a different opinion, but it maybe come from experts or come from very reliable source. That may help a little bit, but we did see this individual difference that make a huge difference in terms of how open, how receptive people to different designs.
This is maybe a variant of a very classic question that's been asked about 1 billion times, but how much do you think tech and interface design can do about moving people from being more defensive about their ideas, about their, whatever they think, versus being a little bit more open-minded and looking for accuracy?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think especially given how things are going in the past few years, I'm not like super optimistic. And to be honest, like after some of the study did, seeing that only 25% people can be nudged, like that does make me feel less optimistic as well. But I think the point is we have to understand the mechanism, right? If we know that this defense motivation is something make a huge difference, then what we need to target is to mitigate or bring down people's defense motivation. And this can be in terms of design, that starting with first acknowledging people's position, acknowledging there are common ground before injecting different opinions. So I think that from the mechanism side, that would be helpful, but I don't have the number. I don't have the conclusion say like how quantitatively how much, what percentage people will actually be open to that.
That's fair. Let's get a little bit into some of your more recent work on explainability. And I do want to flag here for anybody listening that we are talking about explainability versus interpretability, different things. And maybe, Vera, you'd be a really good person just to kind of lay out what are some maybe misconceptions or ways people tend to conflate topics or misunderstand explainability.
Oof, yeah. So yeah, that's a good point to start. What's the difference between explainability and interpretability? But I'm actually not a big fan of getting very bogged down into that. I feel even in the academic literature, people use different scope. People cite like philosophy literature, psychology literature to define the term. But you clearly see some people think interpretability is only about or narrower than explainability. For example, one version of definition is interpretability is more about if the model itself is easy to understand, intuitive. For example, decision tree may be inherently interpretable. While other people would use the definition interpretability is broader than explainability. So I always start with the definition that explainability is about enabling human understanding. And that really kind of ground this definition in terms of what's the goal. It's really about understanding. It's human centered. And maybe in this conversation, we can adopt that definition and stick more with this term of explainability. I do differentiate though between transparency and explainability. More lately, I've been using the term transparency because explainability, especially with explanation, people think more in terms of the model's process or the internal, how it makes a decision, why it gives a certain input. But transparency can be broader than that. There can be this mechanistic transparency about the mechanism. There's also can be functional transparency in terms of what's the model's capability that may be communicated by evaluation. And also we can care about this kind of more process-oriented transparency, right? How was the model developed? What's the training data? So these are what I would say how I define transparency. So yeah, that's maybe we can use those definitions for this discussion.
Great. Let's talk about one way in which you've investigated some of the algorithmic work on this topic. And I think a great paper to start with is questioning the AI. You worked on this while you were at IBM. I'd love for you to maybe introduce some of the thinking you were doing here. You interviewed different UX design practitioners and developed a question bank. Could you tell me a little bit about the motivations there?
Yeah, happy to. So that really goes back to what I mentioned in the beginning when I was working on this toolkit, my struggle with this gap of these are the tech knowledge, but we really don't know what kind of explanation people need. But there's also a fundamental challenges here. The downstream adoptions are delayed, right? Practitioners have not started using it. You are not seeing a lot of end user feedback. So the question is really, I'm interested in this whole design space of what kind of explanation people need. But how can I even probe that design space if I don't find like real world implementation to do it? So the way how I approach this, I realize designer who are often doing this bridging role, that they have a good understanding of what their user need, what kind of user they are working with. Then they also trying to bridge this technical affordance limitation they're working with. So they can give me a lot of insights. If I talk to one designer, I can have a pretty good understanding of their domain. So I started out doing this research. I'm just going to talk to many designers to have a view of what are different applications. But then another challenge here is also practitioner at that point, they might not be familiar with those algorithms, and you really don't want to bother them with a lot of the detail of these algorithms. So we had this idea of we want to create I call a sociotechnical abstraction. I'm not going to talk about what the algorithm does. But there are social science literature and HCI literature as well, suggesting that people's explanatory goal, what they want from explanation, can be expressed by the question they ask. If you ask a why question, a how question, a what if question, those are different kinds of explanation you are looking for. So we basically take those kind of work and decide to ground what an explainability algorithm can do in terms of what kind of question they can answer. What we're also looking at is what are some other questions people might ask that's not addressed by this current explainability algorithm. So we first did using some of the survey paper, looking at what are the common forms of explanation and map to what are the questions they can answer. For example, if you have a global kind of explanation, tell you what's the general logic, that maybe answer a how question, versus a local explanation tell you, for this particular prediction is because this particular important feature. And that's answer a why question. And then another common category is a counterfactual explanation. Say if you change this input a little bit, you get a different output. That may be answer a why not question. So we have this kind of common question that current algorithm can address as a starting point. We bring that to designers. We ask them, oh, tell us about a particular application you work on. And then what are some common questions you imagine your user will ask to understand the AI? And then we also discuss these common categories of why, how, what if do they appear in their application. So I would say another point is at that time, I think when I look back, I realize it's actually what people have in terms of question is broader than understanding internal process. So it's actually closer to how I see transparency these days. So you will see a lot of question is not just about why question, how question, but also the data question, the performance question, the input output space question. So one contribution we try to make is have this we call XAI question bank, which are more than 50 questions we gather from this interview, talking to more than 20 designers. And then also they're categorized in different clusters. And also we're trying to have some high level takeaway in terms of for this kind of question, what explanation people actually want, what are the reasons, how we might provide explainability for that category. And also did some kind of a gap analysis to show, current algorithms are focusing on this category, but actually people have a lot of questions around, for example, data around this counterfactual question that may not very well addressed by current algorithms.
As you talk about in a lot of places, different users are going to have different sorts of questions. There might be different levels of abstraction that are appropriate for different users. And we can do a pretty good job of categorizing what questions a particular user might be most interested in, and then figure out what explainability, what other techniques are most appropriate to that situation. Do you think that there is ever an unknown unknowns question where maybe a user has a vague idea of what they want to know about a system, but perhaps for that user, it is really vitally important that they know something and they just don't know that they're supposed to know that thing? Or do you think that's just like a skill issue? Or do you think there's maybe something inherent there? Do you think that there are cases where people just genuinely can't figure that out?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I definitely acknowledge that there's limits to what we can probe with the questions. You make a very good point. There are no unknowns. Probably another perspective that's helpful is I think of explainability not in terms of just what what we need to review by algorithm. I think we need to take a goal-oriented stance, right? Ultimately, people want explanation is because there is a knowledge gap for them to reach some kind of goal. But this gap is also dependent on that particular goal. So it may be helpful, like whether when we're design or when we're doing evaluation in terms of whether this explanation design is enough, is by articulating that goal first. And then if we say in this case of decision support or in this use case of debugging a model, ultimately can help us to see even we try to answer this question people raised in the beginning, there's still some gap for them to reach that goal. And that help us to iteratively to probe where this knowledge gap is, right? Maybe that's filled by explanation, but there's also, I think another point is we kind of have to take a broader view in terms of information support, right? It can be information about the model's process, but sometimes it's actually about information about the domain, information about the social context, or information about how do I see this AI system work in general. So it's all these different kinds of knowledge gap we need to fill, and very likely you will not be able to completely fulfill that knowledge gap in one try. So you have to do it in a more iterative fashion.
One unfortunate or exciting thing about question banks, depending on how you look at it, is this evolution that seems necessary as AI systems themselves evolve, as people realize, hey, there are new things we can do with these systems. And so, as user perhaps personas, as user goals develop, how do you think about the, I suppose, meta question of how do we sort of help users evolve the kinds of questions that they need to ask?
That's a really good question. I think I guess there's also a lot of work around how do we improve AI literacy. I feel like that's definitely a place to start. But there's also a point that I think you make a good point in terms of kind of proactively fill the knowledge gap, right? That also requires potentially studying where this general people's mental model is currently. I think a lot in terms of right now with the introduction of large language model, but it's also so much people's mental model or public perception is shaped by this very complex mechanism in terms of how companies are promoting this technology, how particular application like the ChatGPT that people are first introduced to. So there are definitely risks in terms of people have kind of flawed mental model or flawed perception. So I think that we definitely also need research to study where people are in terms of their mental model. And we're seeing some HCI study looking at there are already common wrong perception when people think about is this something generated by AI or is something human written, and how people come up with heuristics or rules to differentiate them. But there's already pretty common misperception that people already share. So I feel this kind of research in terms of common perception, common misperception is also really important. And then we can probably start thinking about how, as technologists or designer, we can proactively correct misperception or fill this kind of common gaps in the understanding.
You have another observation in this paper that I actually found rather important. You said that informants that you worked with had to work with other product goals that might be at odds with explainability. And you spoke earlier a little bit about how explainability isn't something we're seeing as much when it comes with companies' AI products, but there certainly are a number right now of for profit companies that do align themselves with the vision of offering transparency, of offering explainability for users' ML systems. And I wonder if you think that there's an inherent tension there when it comes to I'm a for profit company, but then also I'm offering what is purported to be an explainable AI solution.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are really several reasons we don't see that in production. I would say it depends on what kind of product you are working with. I feel explainability is probably more common in kind of analytical tool or enterprise tool compared to end users. I think one challenge that's probably true to a lot of responsible AI efforts is just they take efforts, they take hard work. I think explainability or fairness, those kind of problem are really hard problem. That's not something, for example, you can evaluate with a benchmark and then be done with it. You have to put a lot of kind of effort and time in there. So often this responsible AI effort is just at odds with product's timeline because it's time consuming. It requires a lot of collaboration between designers, user research, and data scientists that in a lot of product we just don't have that kind of process to support that. I think that's structural barrier that's just hard to overcome at this point. But there's also situation that transparency or explainability feature that can be odds with other concern like security concerns or privacy concern. These are also I would say, very much actively researched topic. I've seen some kind of interesting solution on the practitioner side, how to get around it. But we do have to see sometimes transparency feature do come at a cost of potentially security risk as well.
Sure. One last thought I had with this paper was an articulation, I think towards the end, that I particularly liked, where you note that prior work repeatedly pointed out that a prerequisite for explanations is to be interactive because, and in your words, explanation is a grounding process where people incrementally close belief gaps. And there's that word gap coming up again. Could you spend a second unpacking that a little bit for me, how you think about the interactive component of this, since I think we haven't dug into that yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, as you said, right, fundamentally, explanation or trying to build a common ground, it is a social process in our human to human interaction. So by interactive, there are many different forms, right? So people ask different kinds of questions because you have different kind of gap, you have different goals. You may also ask follow-up questions if your understanding is not completely fulfilled. So I think just coming from this human explanation point of view, it's just by nature an interactive process. I think it's very intuitive for us to pursue interaction technique or explainability technique that's more interactive, because this is a gap filling process. This is a grounding process, and then very natural for people to ask different questions, asking follow-up questions. So that's definitely, I feel, a direction that the field is going and should going, and something that I myself is very excited about.
Yeah, I appreciate that vision. Let's move on to a couple of your other papers along this domain. And so you had this work that was looking into social transparency with Upal-Ehsan. And I think there's a lot of really interesting framing here, but maybe we could just quickly talk a little bit about the main ideas here and what you kind of hope people take away from this.
Yeah. I believe you interviewed Upal at some point.
He was on the podcast a while ago,
Yes.
yes.
I would say this is really like his baby, his work. I
Yeah.
did more of a supporting role in this work. I think the point, there are several aspects that we kind of start working on this together. One is, so at that point, he started pushing this kind of a social technical perspective. But I've been thinking in terms of this goal-oriented perspective. We have to understand people's goal. And of course, inherent in that is people is not working in isolation. They are situated in a particular kind of social context. Their goal and their needs is very much shaped by this kind of context. So we came to work together because we both hold this kind of view of we have to understand this socio-technical context to inform what explanation is needed. And then another point about this social technical perspective where Upal really brought in with the initial idea is that also from this informational perspective, what people often needs to understand to achieve their end goal, let's take this decision-making context, is not necessarily within the model. It's not just how the model make the decision, but also other kinds of factor that governs the use of the model. So we have to not just understand this technical system, but understand the socio-technical system. But of course, it's hard to practically to think about what's a feature that help people understand this socio-technical system. So we had a lot of discussion, and then we kind of went back to some of the social computing CSW literature in terms of on a social media or social network, right? How do you try to have some transparency in terms of the social network? What you can do is making other people's interaction traces record them and make them available transparent. So we inspired by that idea. We essentially resort to this idea of recording and make it visible how other people interacted with this AI system, their reasoning, why they accept an AI decision or not. And their reasoning can be qualitative. It can cover many different aspects. For example, I'm not accepting this AI decision because there's a new policy change, or there's some kind of feature that's not really in the model's decision. And then we had this framework, which is pretty intuitive. I think we call it 4W. So who interacted with the system, what happened, when that interaction happened, and why. Why did they, for example, in decision context, is accepted or rejected? And then we make them available in a very rudimentary form. Is maybe like a Yelp review to see how other people made their decision. But that's sort of a kind of a initial idea where we're exploring, and we just have a study to show even just presenting this kind of review format can help a lot in terms of understanding the AI, and more importantly, help people achieve their end goal to have the information they need.
One broad idea this introduces to our conversation that I think hasn't come up so far is that looking at things as not just I am a human who is working with an AI system and there's maybe a gap here, I'm trying to understand this thing external from me, but perhaps as Upal has articulated this, a human AI assemblage. This is all kind of molded together. And as you put it, the sociotechnical system as a singular whole. And it seems like maybe as things evolve or in different papers, there's one or the other of these views. There's the human AI assemblage, or there is the human who is maybe sitting apart from an AI system trying to understand it. Do you think, or where do you maybe think that these perhaps somewhat different views of what's going on might be more or less useful?
Yeah, I think we need both. I think there's a longer, not debate, but I guess perspective in HCI that some part of HCI is more inspired by cognitive science that pays more attention in terms of how individual attend to information, process information, those kind of questions. And another side is maybe more kind of a social science, sociology inspired that pay attention to this whole sociotechnical system, how people interact as a group or interact as assemblage. I think we need both. They serve complementary purposes, I think. Of course, especially when you are designing a system ultimately being deployed, you have to have that understanding of the social context, and then the tool in terms of how we approach this socio-technical system, the method will be really, really important. And a lot of issue you have to understood by situated in a socio-organizational context. While this more kind of cognitive perspective, I think that give us sometimes a pretty rigorous understanding in terms of what exactly is happening in this whole interaction process, or in this quality process when people are working with a particular system. And sometimes, of course, they can inform each other, right? For example, if you understand how individually people process information or interact with particular interface, that will also give you some power to infer collectively if there are different kinds of people. Some people follow this process, that process, how things may work in a network, and that there are also methodology, for example, agent-based modeling, or that kind of leverage bring this two perspective together.
Yeah, one other way to think about it perhaps is just looking at these two views as almost different levels of abstraction. As you said, we do have to understand psychologically how humans work, how they interact with things, maybe how they interact with technology just in general, and what pitfalls and benefits that has. And then on the other hand, we have the technology. This is a whole rabbit hole that we can understand on its own. And then, sort of bringing that up together, we're going up a level of abstraction when we talk about the sort of human AI collective. And I'm sure that maybe misses the mark in some ways, but perhaps that's another way of thinking about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think this different abstraction is definitely the one angle to think about it. As I said, like you can going from the level of individual interaction that also give you ways or framework to infer how things might happen at a collective level.
Another tack on this that you've worked on is this connecting algorithmic research and usage contexts paper, which I think brings in some new things to this discussion that will be really interesting. And by this point, you were at the Fate group at MSR. Fate, by the way, is like the coolest name for a research group ever. I think it's like totally unfair that MSR got that name. But anyway, on this paper, you're looking at, I suppose, the gaps between algorithmic research and then bringing in some words we've spoken about again, downstream usage context, where you want to contribute basically these taxonomies of explainable AI evaluation criteria and prototypical usage contexts, right? Can you maybe introduce some of the ideas that came up in this paper and some of the more important takeaways?
Yeah, so that's a paper I feel really I was at a point of I was working on like studying practitioner, particular application for a while. I feel that was a point I'm kind of stepping back to see what I have learned about different application, different practice, and also at a point, as I mentioned in the beginning, that I feel we need to kind of going further up on this upstream chain. Ultimately, we can think about what is different methods in terms of how do we pick the right algorithm. But if we don't have the right algorithm to begin with, then we just have nothing to work with. So at that point, I think one thing I was struggling with. So I was reading a lot of literature in terms of explainability evaluation. What are the criteria? What are the methods? And then in the literature, for example, people have kind of dozens of criteria, right? Just what to evaluate for. Is it faithfulness? Is it conciseness? Those kind of things. But there's really a one size fits all solution. Assumption that seems to say what these are important. But first, they're just impossible to satisfy all the criteria, right? If you want to have this criteria, for example, comprehensiveness, right? It may be often at odds with conciseness, for example. And then another point is I work on different kinds of applications, seeing practitioner working with different application. They do have very different needs that people have, right? For example, just take two common use case that you have data scientists that you want explanation to debug the model. And very commonly, if you see the system that people have is it's very comprehensive. There are global explanation, local explanation, but it's also complex. Like data scientists are very familiar with visualization. Versus if you're looking at a decision support system, let's say a medical imaging system that you want to help a doctor to make a judgment, should they follow the AI's recommendation? Then first is what they care about. The main thing they care about is this particular prediction trustworthy or not? So their goal is to detect the error of that particular prediction. And second, they're very much time constrained, so they don't want very complex interface. They don't want very complex information. So they clearly have different success criteria when you're thinking about explanation. So my goal is really highlight this perspective of context dependency of evaluation criteria. What I did was we took this literature survey of there are dozens of a dozen of evaluation criteria talked in the explainability literature, but there's also a lot of HCI work studying application, including our work looking at the whole space. And then we can have a taxonomy of at least common use cases of explanation. Then we want to illustrate that in this different use case, for example, model debugging, bias detection or fairness judgment, decision support. There are two more. I'm kind of going blank. we want to show the priority in terms of criteria are different. So we had this methods of scenario-based survey that we recruit both experts of explainable AI and also targeted end user of a particular application. We gave them this scenario of you are using this application, you have this particular use case in mind, really prime that with the use case, and then ask them to rate this list of 12 different criteria, which one matters, how important each one is. And we can clearly show that even just with this method of asking people's opinion, there is a clear difference. For example, again, with data, with the debugging, what people care a lot is whether it's faithful. Give them the very faithful information about how the model work, comprehensiveness, versus in a decision support context, the most important thing people care about is help me detect if the model is confident, if the model is wrong. While they can even sacrifice some level of faithfulness of the explanation. So I would say it's more of a framing paper. We want to highlight its context dependency with some empirical study which show there's indeed already a difference.
One of your findings in this paper that you talk about is that, and I guess I'm quoting here, that across all contexts, faithfulness was considered the most important criterion. And I have my own intuitions about why this might be the case, but I'm curious to hear your reasoning for why that was true.
Yeah, I think that is actually very consistent with what the academic literature think about the space, because this use of post hoc explanation, right? Faithfulness is one of the evaluation criteria I would say most work dedicated to, because there's a whole risk of you can use post hoc explanation, but they're not really faithful to what model actually doing. Then of course there's a lot of risk that you're not giving people the right information. So it's not too surprising for me that it is considered important. It's somewhat actually interesting to see in some cases, for example, when people want to have, and the user want to have control, they can sacrifice the faithfulness a little bit as long as the explanation is helpful for them to achieve their end goal.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Another one of the things you pointed out in this paper was sort of about the different types of explanations users might seek and the benefits of those. And it seems like comparatively, when you look at example based explanations, they seem to come up ahead in your picture on almost every front that I can think of. And I'm curious if you could speak to just maybe some limitations, some issues with example based explanations broadly.
That's a good question. I think the first response is I think the field used the term example-based explanation kind of broadly. There are many different kinds of example-based explanation that you can find influential example from the data. You can construct example that's most similar to this case. You can show example explanation with ground truth or without ground truth. I think one probably the limitation about challenge is how do we differentiate them in terms of their benefit or drawbacks. I think we don't have a very clear picture. Some of our most recent work trying to get there. There's another limitation is also they don't necessarily directly get to the process, right? They give you some analogy for you to think about why, for this particular case, things go this way or that. But it may not give people a whole picture of how the model actually work with different features. So one limitation I can see is they maybe have limited generalizability in your understanding. You can understand this particular use case, particular input, but you might not be able to generalize that to other examples or other inputs.
Right. And I guess, as you point out, still, despite these things, it is a clear improvement, it feels, over feature based explanations, which, as you said, in a few places are just kind of incompatible with the ways people reason. I think before we move on to some of the more recent work, and that's, I think, where we'll get really deep into LLMs and some of your recent work on that. Another very important branch of your work is uncovering pitfalls in existing methods. And I think we've spoken in some broad strokes about things like whether there's an inherent limit to what an explainable AI method can do. But this is something that's been studied in a lot of places, and you've had a few papers on this front. I'm curious what maybe the most important findings have been to you among the research you've done exploring some of these pitfalls.
Right. I think there are some are important in terms of the finding, and some are important in terms of the takeaway message. I think that the one of the longest line of my work is understanding why this very, very popular feature-based important explanation just doesn't work well for decision support. So we started with one paper that's published in Fact 2020 that was with my former IBM colleague Yunfeng Zhang and Rachel Bellamy. So it was not, it was a little bit accidental. So we're running an experimental study. We're looking at a kind of different information about decision support ML system. So the basic setup is you have a ML system that's making a prediction. Let's say this person belongs to a high income or low income group. And then you have this human decision maker trying to make a final judgment, which essentially is to decide, do I rely on this model's prediction or not? We find that this very popular feature importance explanation tell you this person is a high income group because they have a long education, or this person did some particular types of job, actually reduce people's decision accuracy somewhat compared to not showing explanation at all, just showing the model prediction. And similar finding has also been replicated in many other studies in HCI. And that kind of set me to 2 years of work, just understand why this is happening. So I think maybe two work that's most relevant. One is another paper with Upo. The title is Explainable to Whom. We're essentially trying to get to like how people actually interact with explanation. But the general finding is, perhaps if you're looking back, not too surprisingly, that people, even AI experts, they don't necessarily very carefully reason about the explanation. We know, like from reading books like Thinking Fast and Slow, people can have this slow thinking, carefully reason about information, make a rational judgment, but people can also actually often resort to this fast thinking by invoke heuristic. What we find essentially is that people already have a lot of overly positive heuristics about explanation that associating, oh, this model can explain itself, it must be intelligent, it must be trustworthy, it's being transparent. So that leads to this over-trusting, over-reliance when people working with the AI system that is explainable. And a more recent work with Valerie Chen, who is an intern last year, that we're using this kind of good old psychology method to ask people to think aloud. They do a decision task. We ask them to just verbalize what they're thinking. And we're trying to see what exactly is happening. So that was what we find it as, even in situation where people are cognitively engaged, we're already forcing them to articulate their reasoning process. There are still limitations. One reason is because, so if you want to detect model error, what you do is you have to apply some kind of domain knowledge or your own rationale to say the model's rationale is wrong. But the feature-based explanation actually interacts with people's own rationale. They are pretty visually overwhelming, right? They highlight important feature and then they disrupt people's own reasoning. If you don't show that explanation, they may have a clear reason of this person should be a high income job because they have a certain job. But when you show explanation, you are essentially trying to convince people the model's reasoning, that people become weaker in terms of their own rationale. And also, human rationale is very much qualitative. You can say a certain job should have high impact in terms of income, but it's very hard for you to say job should have 20% more contribution than education. And once people are confronted with this very quantitative, precise explanation, again, they feel like less confident about themselves, then they decided to resort to the model. So I feel at this point, I finally have a relatively good understanding why it has that limitation. But I think the more takeaway message for me is a lot of times algorithms may have pitfall because it's not competitive or compatible with people's cognitive process, and we really have to do empirical understanding to see how things fail, and also learn from psychology theories, cognitive science about people actually process information to see where there is the gap that needs to be filled.
There are a lot of intersections here, and one of the ones I want to drag out a little bit that you brought up is the ideal system to thinker. And that's kind of the ideal user we have versus the real user who engages in cognitive heuristics. And this maybe does not play so nicely with the affordances of just technical systems in general, which do not slow down. And when you think about the ways that people want to implement what is considered a good user experience, we want things to be fast. We want people to get feedback quickly. But there is a lot of work in slow algorithms. And I think you've also done some work yourself on seamful styles of interaction, where we actually selectively expose people to the pitfalls and the systems they're dealing with. But maybe speaking just to that slowing down thing, I think like Byung-Chul Han is somebody who's brought this up in a really like interesting way that I like, where he talks about the way that technical systems we use today are just inherently opposed to slow, deliberate contemplation, that system two thinking that you're thinking about. And this makes me wonder, do you think that some of the XAI methods that, maybe are not the best on their own, but then combined with the design affordance, something like a slow algorithm, could help nudge people's cognitive processes in the directions that you might want when it comes to being a little bit more contemplative when they are dealing with an explainability method?
Yeah, you're very much on point. I think how do we slow people down is something many people are working on these days. I think you mentioned this very new work been doing with seamful design. So it is a long-standing thought or literature in the HCI field that is this kind of opposition of seamful design versus seamless design, right? Often people think in terms of seamless design is a virtual. You plug and play. People don't need to think about it. People don't even in the UBCon world, like people don't even need to be aware there is a computer. But that actually creates a lot of problem because first, like again, coming back to the sociotechnical gap, right? So there's really not possible to have seamless technology. Whenever we put a computation in a particular context, there's always seams, there's always breakdown. So we need to actually expose them. Of course, the key point is how do we make a deliberate decision in terms of what to expose, what not to expose. You don't want to completely ruin the user experience by only having people seeing seams. So there is a process to really deliberate on what are the seams where things might break down, and also deliberate on what kind of breakdown we want to expose to people that matters for their end goal. So that's sort of the very, very high level of that simple work. And another thing, another side you touched on is how we can do better, whether in decision support or in general, in terms of slowing people down. So one line of work we're seeing is considering this kind of a cognitive reinforcing function of how do we slow people down. This can be literally just encourage people to take more time to think about it. Or you can create some friction in the interaction that, for example, not showing all the information first, but encourage people to make their own decision first. and then showing the model's explanation or model's decision. And I think another kind of shift, especially in this AI decision support context, I'm very happily seeing right now is this shifting away from supporting end decision. Because once you give people this end decision, it can create a kind of issue that people skip the whole deliberative process. But instead, supporting verification or human reasoning. And that can require us to rethink this whole AI assistance paradigm, right? For example, what helps may not be model make a decision, but model doing some kind of summarization, or model look through the documentation and give you information support. So we don't have to be obsessed with this idea of models supporting final decision is another direction that we should think about.
I like that there are many different ways and places in that process that a model can plug in. And the summarization, maybe there's a way in which I can kind of refine my own thinking with the model as an interlocutor along the way to making a final decision. And maybe I prompt the model to do something like reflect back at me in a particular way the judgments that I've made or something. And then maybe my biases become more apparent to me or something like that. Those seem really useful. I want to work towards your recent paper with Jennifer Wortman-Vaughan on AI transparency in the age of LLMs. And so, as a place to begin, as you mentioned, you worked on chatbots at IBM Research and became a little bit disillusioned. I'd love to hear a bit about how that experience and your work there informed how you were thinking about chatbots and how you kind of responded to this whole like chat GPT instruction tuning moment that we're in.
Yeah, that's a great question to start. I think in the beginning, like many people probably, I was very excited because I understood in the last hype cycle how hard it is to develop a good chatbot that I even have somewhat fluent interaction that does not break down. So when I first interact with ChatGPT, for example, I was like, oh, this is so much better. But of course, brings many other kinds of problem like hallucination is actually hard to control. In fact, if you see a lot of products right now, people are very hesitant to directly utilize LLM to power the whole chatbot, right? We're still seeing some combination of old way, for example, still define the kind of intents you want to cover. Maybe you can use LLM to generate some training data for your intents. I think just forego the whole control to LLM at this time is not a right approach with chatbot. I think I'm excited about this time because my general interest in this sociotechnical gap, I find is a really interesting time that there's such a emerging technology, and then there's so many diverse ways people are developing application, not just chatbot, right? Writing support, those kind of things are we're seeing all kinds of application, and it's a time we have to. It's exciting, but also time that we really need to understand the pitfall, reflect on also what are the different kinds of use cases, what is the space that things may fail, to be really careful. Coming back to like what perspective informed that particular paper is I think for me, very much is this idea, as you said in the beginning, we want to resist the urge of inevitability that everything is changing. We have to do things completely differently. Of course, chatbot is something that people have worked on decades and decades. There's so many lessons to learn, and same with transparency. So we kind of started at a time. Of course, you're seeing new kind of technical excitement like mechanistic interpretability, and people start thinking about new algorithm. But there's just so much we can learn from these years of research on AI transparency. So our kind of high level goal is really to highlight We don't have to start from scratch, and there are some really important lessons we need to learn from this past 5-10 years of AI transparency research. And once we equip with those lessons, we can carefully think about how things might be different. So how we structure that paper is essentially starting with the lessons learned. And I would say two aspects. One is we have to embrace diverse transparency approach. It's not just about explanation. We have to also think about transparent model reporting, like model cards, communicating evaluation results, and communicating model uncertainty. And these are very basic aspects to think about. And then also there are so many important lessons of this human-centered perspective, right? Starting with people have different goals with transparency, with understanding, and we have to think about what are the goals in this age of LLMs. And then from the usage, there's also lessons about this cognitive process, right? This due process, or where this cognitive process may not be compatible. And then also think about, for example, the stakeholder perspective, right? Who are the new stakeholders? How things might change in the ecosystem, and then we can begin to ask how things are different. So what are the unique challenges? So we summarize a few lessons in that, not lesson, a few points in that paper about how things might be different. And each of these difference may give rise to new question in terms of why evaluation might not work this way, why explanation might not work this way, right? I think the points, if I think about it, is kind of in 4 areas of how things might, what are the unique challenge in terms of transparency for LLM. The first one is more technology specific, right? This is a different kinds of model. They have complex, diverse capability, and also they have uncertain capability, right? They have emerging behavior. They can be steered by different prompts. So there's a very fundamental challenge that even for model developer themselves, they may not be fully anticipate what is the capability. So that gives rise to very fundamental challenges of how do we even start to characterize the model capability? You've seen some work, for example, either they try to just use the description of smaller generative models, right? You can say the model can do QA, can do summarization, but is that enough or even useful to cover the capability of large language model? And then some people maybe start thinking about, oh, what are the human cognitive capability, and use that to describe the model. But will that kind of description characterization useful, for example, if I'm a practitioner trying to decide, do I use this model for my application? So that's on the technology side. There's also a side is this kind of a new application people are developing, right? And then also how it is changing the whole ecosystem that people are developing application. Like, we're seeing on the ground, for example, very commonly practitioners are not directly use the base GPT model. They're doing a lot of adaptation work, whether it's writing prompts or doing fine tuning. And also a lot of things happen at orchestration level, doing grounding or having the plug-in to operate ML. So I have to also think about this different kinds of application. Do they need the new transparency approach to whether explain how the system work or characterize the system? And there's also a question of who are the new stakeholders, right? Again, it changes this ecosystem. For example, you have this new role of doing prompt engineer, or maybe a designer or product manager is doing the prompting, right? They maybe have particular needs in terms of, can I have explanation to improve the prompt I have? So we have to think about this new application, new ecosystem, and this new stakeholders' needs. And some of the application, for example, many of them are natural interface, interactive interface. So that also changes the kind of modality, the design space we work with. But last point is also we have to also consider the challenge in terms of the whole socio-societal context of how things are changing, right? Of course, organizations, the companies that putting out LLM, they may not have incentive to provide transparency, and this kind of problem cannot be approached as a technical design problem. We have to think about policy. And also, again, coming back what I mentioned earlier, this changing public perception, how they are shaped by this hype, shaped by how companies are communicating this technology. And that create a huge challenge in terms of transparency, because ultimately it's about shape people's mental model, and we have to start with where people currently are. So yeah, so that's the four aspects: the technical, the application, the stakeholder, and the whole societal environment at this moment.
That's a really helpful breakdown. One question here I have is earlier we've talked a lot about how many explainable AI methods, as opposed to what we're talking about here, transparency, are really in service of user goals. So there's this directionality. We start with the user, they kind of know what they want to use their system for, and that informs the questions we then ask. Transparency here, I'm wondering how you think about it as sort of an opposite directionality, where, yes, in many cases, people do have defined applications, defined use cases, but we are still living in a world where there's a lot about these systems that we don't understand, and there are many limitations that have yet to be seen. So I'm curious how you think about transparency sort of informing perhaps the goals or going in that opposite direction.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think it's probably relevant in terms of thinking, especially with large language model. I think this question of how do we do responsible use matter, right? So I think that's another motivation for us to really focus on the limitation rather than the capability, because a lot of the use is going to be shaped by our understanding of what's limitation. And this can happen for multiple stakeholders, right? For example, if you're an application developer, understanding limitation will help you decide, I have this platform, I have this particular user problem, where I'm going to use an LLM, and what is an acceptable use case for me to use LLM. And end user understanding also shape their interaction. If I know the model tend to fail in this use case, then I may not have that kind of interaction with the model. So I think it definitely helping people understanding limitation and transparency approach that highlight the limitation is a big part of shaping this responsible use, whether it's at the practitioner level or it's at an end user level.
Another component of what you talk about here is you speak to a number of different factors that make transparency for LLMs challenging. And one of the important ones that I think pretty much everybody is privy to is the fact that we are working with massive opaque architectures, and there aren't answers to how and why these models work as well as they do. And what's interesting to me here, again, this is maybe the kind of high level thing. We've been talking about explainable AI a lot, but the concerns in here are looking for explanation as opposed to merely empirical observation. And that sticks out to me just because there is a line of researchers who are more, I think, pragmatic and empirical when it comes to, well, what we should be doing is more or less find what works. This model can or can't do this task, and we can observe these correlations. We can make correlative statements about what models are capable of and the behavior they exhibit, but we can only really justify what we can observe empirically. And to me, when I think about explanation, the how and why these things, it kind of goes a step beyond that. And so I'm curious if you think there's maybe a tension there with researchers who are very empirically minded and think that we can really only justify the things we can directly observe when it comes to, well, maybe we're seeking something a little bit deeper when it comes to the how and why of these models.
That's a great question. I tend to think maybe I'm also in this more practical, pragmatic camp that I think when we want to highlight like transparency approach is broad, right? Ultimately, it's about having understanding to achieve your end goal. And I think human already have a lot of different devices to have understanding, right? Understanding, like having explanation is just one approach. We often do trial and error. We try something and see where things break, then that actually help us to have a good understanding. So I think especially with large language model, we encourage this kind of more diverse approach, right? Even rethinking, is explanation the right kind of paradigm? We want to give people tools to do model interrogation to see for my particular use case where things might break, that help us, especially from practitioner point of view, to have this more responsible use. But there is a point I'm also interested is how do we have more generalizable understanding? But even there, I think there's a lot of open question. I think there's one point, the Stanford paper, this risk and opportunity foundation model, they have a chapter about interpretability that's really interesting. Is this point of do we treat essentially this one model versus many model paradigm? Do we treat large language model as one single model that is possible to have some kind of generalizable understanding from doing one task to many other tasks? Well, we have to treat it as multiple model, and for specific tasks, we need to have different explanation, and we actually have to kind of resist the urge to generalize. I think that's still very much open question, right? Again, like understanding also have different level. You have local, global explanation. I don't know. Even we have an approach, I say, do post hoc local explanation, how generalizable that understanding is at all. But there's also other approach that people trying to have more theoretical understanding why this model work. Maybe some part of the mechanical interpretability is trying to do that. So yeah, I'm very very excited and looking forward to see where things will have breakthrough in that kind of work. But there's still a question of, yeah, we can have theoretical understanding, but how that help for particular specific task? If I'm just trying to improve my prompt, does that help? Maybe for improving my prompt, actually, it's more helpful for me to just doing a try and error, play with it, have some kind of assistive way to do it. So I feel there is a interesting intellectual question in terms of generalizable or local understanding. I think practically we do need a very broad set of approach to help people achieve different goals.
The last question I'll ask on this paper and LLMs has to do with something that Ted Underwood brought up to me in my conversation with him. He does a lot of very interesting digital humanities work, and he said that in some contexts, you could think of LLMs as being more easily understandable than other AI systems because they can fluently answer questions like, how did you come to this conclusion? Can you explain your reasoning? In one respect, yes, what it is telling us is a little bit more understandable. We don't have to do the extra work of figuring out how to read a diagram, for instance, because we can just read what's being said in natural language. But naturally, that does bring up the question of, well, how much can you trust what's being communicated to you? And this is something you've brought up in a lot of places. But I'll maybe just ask you or frame that question a little bit more broadly. When Professor Underwood says this thing about LLMs, and maybe they're a bit easier to understand because of this feature, because they can more fluently communicate with us. What do you think is right about that picture, and what does it miss?
Yeah, I think that's a fundamentally a question about faithfulness and how we measure faithfulness and what do we think is a threshold or acceptable level of faithfulness, right? So I think a fundamental challenge in this whole explainable AI field is inevitably we have to use some kind of a post hoc explanation just because a lot of model they are not directly intuitive. But we know, like in theory, whenever you use a post hoc explanation, there is a loss of information. So it's not completely faithful to what the model is directly doing. And there are a lot of active research in terms of how do we possibly define faithfulness? How do we possibly measure? It's of course a hard problem because you may not have a way to directly characterize what the model is actually doing. So I think if I look at the measurement, for example, a lot of them are basically looking for the kind of counterfactual evidence, right? Looking for evidence that is not factual, not faithful. Either in some case, this kind of explanation may fail to predict how the model actually make prediction, or some part of feature is missing. But there are also work basically suggesting that is pretty misleading in terms of where the field is going, because we know a lack of a completely faithfulness is inevitable. So the key question is not necessarily how do we quantify faithfulness, but what is an acceptable level of or threshold of faithfulness to use. So that may also goes back to there can be different kinds of lack of faithfulness, right? You may be not making the right kind of prediction in some cases. Maybe you lack certain feature. And this lack of faithfulness and different types of lack of faithfulness may have different impact. And what is acceptable is also highly context dependent, right? Going back to in debugging, maybe it's less acceptable, but in decision making, maybe some kind of lack of faithfulness is okay. So I'm very much coming from this existing perspective in terms of faithfulness when I think about LLM. Of course, I think it's actually dangerous that many people are using explanation as it is without realizing that this is not really faithful. And as we discussed in the paper, there are examples that the model can actually give you contradicting information depending on what this answer is trying to justify. So that really get into there can be deception and misinformation that people actually, if we don't realize that it's there's lack of faithfulness. But ultimately, I think we need to do a lot of first is conceptual work in terms of are there different kinds of lack of faithfulness? How do we characterize them? What is acceptable in different situations? And also empirical work I feel is needed to understand just what situation this model doesn't have faithfulness and can have like a dangerous situation that give you contradicting information. That's something at least I haven't seen and would love to see.
I really appreciate that. The last question I'll pose to you is we've spoken a lot about different sorts of challenges that are coming up right now, especially when it comes to LLMs, challenges for transparency. You just spoke about some of the different things we need to figure out with respect to faithfulness. Very broadly, just speaking about HCI and AI, what do you think are some of the broad challenges ahead that you are thinking about that you hope other researchers and practitioners focus on?
Yeah, I think it's still the kind of pragmatics, right? How do we going beyond this general framing of we need human-centered AI, we need responsible AI, or some people say we need participatory AI, to what are some actionable approach that we can do that? Again, thinking more concretely in terms of what is this ecosystem and who are the people involved in the ecosystem and how we can support them. I think that's something that a question that HCI people are familiar with, right? Studying certain group people, understanding the needs and support them. Especially for me, working often with practitioner, I think there's a huge opportunity um, both in terms of having frameworks like translating, for example, ethical framework in terms of more practical framework. And also, how do we lower the barriers for people to doing this kind of work, whether it's for practitioner to engage in responsible use, doing evaluation, or if we talk about, oh, we want AI researchers to take more human-centered perspective, but how do we have actionable tools or approach for an AI researcher to think about what are the different downstream use cases where things might fail? So how do we make that more actionable is something I feel we need to think a lot. And then also, how do we take this view of ecosystem that build community or build communication channel for things to flow more easily, right? I feel like although my work, a lot of HCI work is trying to study some kind of end user or stakeholder and hopefully bring that perspective back. But who are going to read that papers, and also this question of can we facilitate channels that to directly have end users or impacted group to voice their concerns to directly impact this development of AI technology, whether it's research or practice. So again, how do we support people in the ecosystem, and how do we make this ecosystem a more collaborative work, and also facilitate the communication is something that we should tackle as a community. And I think is especially important at this current time, that going from technology development LM to practice or having some kind of application is almost too fast. We cannot rely on HCI researcher to do careful user research, bring that back. We have to also facilitate the channel of direct voices from the end users.
Fully agree with you here. And I think this is a great place to end. So, Vera, I want to thank you for the work you're doing and the very, very important perspectives you bring to the rest of us. I think that everyone listening to this really needs to pay a lot of attention to your work. So I appreciate the work you do. And thank you so much for being generous with your time and speaking with me today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I feel I also had a lot of reflection and learning in the conversation. Thanks very much.
That is all we have for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Again, if you enjoy what we're doing, there are multiple ways to support us. If you like the podcast, you should make sure that you're subscribed on whatever podcast player you're using to listen to this. And finally, you can find our other articles and newsletters by subscribing to us on Substack and at thegradient.pub.